Welcome to our presentation on the documentary Reckonings. Fred Rosenbaum is known to many in the community. He's an award-winning historian and author and an expert in World War II, and in particular on the Holocaust and the related issues following the end of World War II. Fred is also the founder of Lehrhaus Judaica, which until it is now New Lehrhaus, has been the largest Jewish adult education organization, I believe, in all of California, and now is represented by New Lehrhaus, newlehrhaus.org. Fred, take it away on the documentary Reckonings.
Hey, thank you so much, Riva, for arranging this, and Neely for all your help on the tech side. I wanted to mention that because this is a recording, I still am interested in any questions or comments you have. So as you see, under my image is not my name, but my email. Feel free to send me anything that comes to mind after this talk, and I will get back to you. So Reckonings covers a vital subject that has received too little attention. The tripartite reparations agreement reached among Israel, West Germany, and world Jewry, the latter represented by the Claims Conference. No state had ever before made restitution to victims of genocide. The Ottoman Turks slaughtered 1.5 million Armenians in 1915. None of the survivors of that received reparations. But since the 1952 Luxembourg agreements, there have been several examples of recompense. The United States compensated the Japanese on the West Coast who had been interned during World War II. And Japan indemnified the so-called comfort women who had been made sex slaves for its soldiers in Korea and elsewhere. Now, the Luxembourg agreements, 7 years after the Holocaust, were also unprecedented in another way, in creating a connection between Israel and West Germany, where before there had only been ice-cold silence. In fact, it was foundational in the relationship between those two countries, which established diplomatic relations in 1965, ultimately became close allies. Konrad Adenauer began a process of reconciliation carried forward by other visionary German leaders, such as Willy Brandt and Angela Merkel. Now, the tension and secrecy of the negotiations are well conveyed in the film, as is the historical background, often illustrated with rare and revealing archival footage. Adenauer's granddaughter enriches the film, as does Ben Ferencz at 102, who also wrote a landmark study of forced laborers for the giant German corporations, such as IG Farben Chemicals, Krupp Munitions Manufacturing, Siemens Electronics. Largely due to his activism, those companies finally paid reparations after many decades of stonewalling. So Reckonings offers a great deal, but it's too laudatory of the Claims Conference, which in the last 2 decades has been engulfed in controversy and scandal, completely missing from the film. So I'd like first to amplify some of the themes of the glorious early years shown in the documentary, and then fill in the darker side of the story, which the movie omits. The Jewish leaders who brought about the Luxembourg agreements and who remained at the helm of the Claims Conference for decades, they were exemplary in their foresight and daring, in their skill and dedication. But the second and third generation in charge fell woefully short of the high standards set by the founders. And we'll get to that darker side later. Now, the agreements would not have occurred were it not for two giants on the world stage. Konrad Adenauer, the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, and Nahum Goldmann, the most admired Jewish leader in the entire diaspora. It was the unusual rapport between the two, the mutual respect, the mutual esteem in which they held one another that initiated the project and shepherded through several crises, any one of which could have strangled it in its cradle. Goldmann is not well enough known. He did not represent a country. He was a statesman without a state. As he spoke for world Jewry in the aftermath of its greatest catastrophe. Political scientists consider this a classic example of power wielded by, as they put it, a non-state actor. Claims Conference brought together 23 disparate Jewish organizations for one purpose: reparations. I know of no greater display of unity in Jewish history. And they elected Goldmann chairman by acclamation. Let's look at the first image. He was born to religious parents in Lithuanian shtetl. But when still a young child at the turn of the century, the family immigrated to Frankfurt, Germany. He grew up immersed in European philosophy, literature, and classical music. He attended the renowned Heidelberg University and became an attorney. Yet despite being so enamored with Western civilization, he was an ardent Zionist his whole life, having visited Palestine as early as 1913 when he was only 18. He fled Nazi Germany in 1935 for New York, where he and America's leading Zionist, Rabbi Stephen Wise, founded the Progressive World Jewish Congress, of which Goldmann became president only a year before the Luxembourg Agreements. He would later be president of the World Zionist Organization for more than 2 decades. But Goldmann was also a strong advocate of the diaspora, believing that a state could not answer all the needs of the Jewish people. A man without borders. He fought to strengthen Jewish life outside of Israel. He once said to Ben-Gurion, you see the world from your kibbutz of Sde Boker. I see it from an altitude of 12,000 feet from an airplane. To the refined cosmopolitan Goldmann, there was always something coarse and grating about the Israelis. I admire them, he said, but it's impossible to be fond of them. Later, he would be critical publicly of Israeli militarism and its treatment of the Palestinians, especially in the occupied territories. Now, all this helps us understand his opposition in 1952 to Israel's demand that it be the sole negotiator with Germany and the sole repository for reparations. Goldmann was loyal to the Jewish state, but even more to world Jewry. Beyond his biography and philosophy, what stands out is Goldmann's personality. He could be charming and ingratiating, wily and manipulative, a man of 1,000 faces, yet with an air of gravitas like no other diaspora leader. Okay, we can remove that image, Neely, thank you. He was well connected in Washington and other capital cities, but he was very convincing in exaggerating his clout with world leaders, which made him feared as well as respected, especially by Konrad Adenauer, who depended on the goodwill of the United States. And enlightened though he was, he believed that Jews controlled the Congress and the White House. Goldman did not disabuse him of that anti-Semitic stereotype, and even gave the German chancellor the impression that he himself was one of those powerful Jews behind the scenes. He also compiled lists of former Nazis in Adenauer's administration. He researched their crimes and let him know that he was holding back this damning information because of their close friendship. Some commentators believe that Goldman even bribed one of Adenauer's top advisors, although that has not been verified. However, he accomplished it. And I don't want to diminish the genuine affection the two had for one another. But Goldman had great sway over Adenauer. At their first meeting, as the film shows, the chancellor listened with rapt attention as Goldman spoke, uninterrupted for 15 minutes. I would add that at the end of that momentous encounter, Adenauer, without consulting anyone, signed a statement committing his government to $1 billion for Israel. Late in the negotiations, the German finance minister arbitrarily slashed that amount, but Goldman persuaded Adenauer to overrule him and save the project. Now, the flamboyant Goldman, a connoisseur of life's pleasures, and the highly disciplined Adenauer, elderly and stern, they had an affinity that went on as long after they signed the agreements. After he retired, Adenauer visited Israel on a goodwill tour as a private citizen in 1966. When he arrived at Yad Vashem, he asked for Goldman to be the only one to accompany him through the soul-stirring museum. As they left, Adenauer said to him, "Without you, I could not have borne it." Adenauer visited Ben-Gurion on this trip, and the two had a very long and friendly conversation. But I doubt if the excitable, often blunt Ben-Gurion would have been as successful as Nachum Goldman in leading the negotiations with Germany. Now, what impelled Adenauer to make his historic speech in the Bundestag in 1951, only 2 years after his country's birth, proposing restitution for Nazi crimes? Only 11% of the population agreed with him, as the film points out. Outrageous as it sounds, most Germans felt they had been the main victims of the war, having been duped by Hitler and then brutally punished by the vindictive Allies. Their cities had been shattered by the bombings, and they had to absorb 10 million ethnic Germans, refugees, while food and other necessities were strictly rationed. Over 1 million of their women and girls had been raped by the Red Army. More than 4 million German soldiers had been killed, and another 3 million were still held in Soviet POW camps, not to be released until the early 1950s. But Adenauer saw far beyond the misery of those early post-war years. Let's look at the next slide, Neely. Now, here you see Adenauer, and I included some of his campaign posters to give you an idea of his appeal to the West German public. But on the upper left, you see just his portrait. And some have said he had a face that looked like it was chiseled in concrete. Now, the campaign posters really reflect his great stature. The one on the top right, it says, with Adenauer, for peace and freedom and unity. And the name of his party is there, the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union Conservative Party. In the lower left, it says that Wiedervereinigung, that means the reunification of Germany, is the main goal of his politique, that would be of his policies. And then if you look at the lower right, you see how he represents stability. His campaign slogan there is no experiments, meaning he is really the safest person that could be the leader of West Germany at that time. Now, the film stresses his Catholic piety and yearning for forgiveness, and I don't doubt that. But his decision was pragmatic as well as principled. He realized, as few of his countrymen did, that for Germany to someday overcome its Nazi past, it would have to acknowledge the immeasurable suffering it had inflicted on European Jewry and make amends. He coined the term Wiedergutmachung, making it good again. A word, however, that rankled Jews because this is something you can't make good again. Forgiveness is out of the question, but it did reflect Adenauer's aspirations, both geopolitical and ethical. Okay, you can remove that image. Thank you. Now, in another momentous decision, though, he let pragmatism eclipse morality. I'm speaking of the shamefully inadequate denazification during the 14 years he was chancellor. He himself had opposed Hitler, who was forced into seclusion in 1933 and also imprisoned briefly. But he was convinced that punishing the millions of former Nazi Party members and officials, or even prosecuting war criminals, would tear his new country apart. The most glaring example was Hans Globke, who played an active role in the racist Nuremberg laws, who instituted stamping the letter J on Jewish passports and required all Jews to adopt the name Israel or Sarah. Well, despite all that, Globke, who had advised Adolf Eichmann, served as Adenauer's powerful chief of staff for more than a decade. With very few exceptions, service in Hitler's regime was no hindrance to promotion in West Germany. From a Jewish perspective, then, reparations was Adenauer's greatest achievement, and the lack of denazification his greatest failure. Never in doubt, though, was the German people's veneration of Adenauer, who would serve until the age of 87 and build a democratic and prosperous nation following the defeat of the most destructive regime in world history. His high stature was the reason the Luxembourg agreements sailed through the Bundestag, despite the opposition of politicians who felt reparations were too costly, and the public who felt restitution was undeserved. But the final vote was 238 in favor and only 24 opposed, with 86 abstentions, mostly from his own conservative party. A year later, he was Time magazine's Man of the Year. It reminds me of Angela Merkel in 2015, also the leader of the CDU, able to convince her highly skeptical government to absorb over 1 million Middle Eastern refugees in a single year. And that too was an act of atonement. Now, in 1952, David Ben-Gurion, like Adenauer, the founder of a new country facing enormous challenges, had a far more acrimonious struggle in passing the agreements in the Knesset. For the reparations issue convulsed Israel. Except for the deadly clash during the War of Independence, it was the most bitter and violent fight among Jews in all of Israel's history. Objectively, there were bigger problems then. The unrest among hundreds of thousands of Palestinians inside Israel's borders, a threat posed by neighboring countries, especially Egypt, which would be at war with Israel only a few years later, be at war again with them. The absorption of 700,000 Holocaust survivors and refugees from Arab lands. Yet the question of opening negotiations with West Germany was by far the more impassioned and divisive issue. There was no limit at all to the vitriol. The most vocal and disruptive opposition leader was the firebrand Menachem Begin, vividly shown in the film. But furious dissent came from multiple sources, including Israel's Communist Party, which demanded that West Germany be shunned, saying it was rife with ex-Nazis and a pawn of the imperialist United States. Yet more revealing to me than the extremists on the right and the left are the fierce arguments within Ben-Gurion's own party, Mapai, Labor, the largest in the Knesset. Let's look at the next slide, please. I'd like to share with you the remarks before the Mapai Central Committee of Golda Meir, then Minister of Labor, who would later serve as Israel's fourth prime minister. In the upper picture, you see her sitting on the right, and she's second from the right, from the bottom, and she is, of course, the only woman in the cabinet. Ben-Gurion sometimes said she's the only real man in the cabinet. And sometimes he even expressed that in a more vulgar way. In any case, there she is as Minister of Labor. And in the lower picture, she's already Foreign Minister of Israel. That's from 1959. Let's look at the next slide. There you see her around the time of the Luxembourg agreements in the early 50s. Now, for the fateful Knesset ballot, Ben-Gurion freed the Mapai members from party discipline. That is, they could vote their conscience, although only if there were enough enough votes to pass the measure. Several did vote no or abstain. In the end, Golda voted yes. But her speech to her Mapai colleagues reveals how excruciating was this decision for her. A woman from Kyiv who lost much of her extended family in the Ukraine. The reparations controversy pitted Israeli against Israeli, but for many, it also caused a deep rift within the soul of the individual Israeli. In this case, someone unusually well-informed, wise, and compassionate. Let's look at her speech, excerpt from her speech. You go to the next slide, please. Now, again, this is before the members of Knesset in her own party. And you wouldn't expect such bitterness from Golda Meir, but here it is. I hold a racist view. All Germans are a priori Nazis. I am not yet prepared to divide the Germans into good and bad. As far as I'm concerned, they're all one and the same. And then she switches gears. But we cannot ignore the real considerations of our survival, and therefore we must ask, is the step we are about to take, negotiating reparations, so wrong that we would avoid taking it, thus endangering progress in building up the country? The people that slaughtered 6 million Jews owe me the opportunity to rescue and pay for the absorption of every Jew who can be rescued. And now she seems to go in the other direction. At the same time, I fear that if we succeed in our negotiations with the Germans, our achievement might lead to forgiveness and forgetting. Therefore, we must repeat day and night that the reparations come from the hands of murderers. We are collecting a detestable, repelling debt. But in view of the situation, it would be a sin to waive it. Now, not every Israeli leader was so conflicted as Golda Meir. Ben-Gurion and Begin, two iron-willed public figures who had taken up arms against each other only a few years earlier, were diametrically opposed. And they dismissed each other's arguments with the greatest contempt. For Ben-Gurion, the survival of the state was paramount. And he knew that it was in desperate shape economically. $1 billion, worth about 15 billion today, could vastly improve the country for longtime Israelis and immigrants alike. Moreover, he looked forward to brisk trade with West Germany, and he rightly predicted that West Germany would become an economic powerhouse and even sell advanced weaponry to Israel. He felt no qualms at all in negotiating with Adenauer. For Begin, himself a survivor who made the Holocaust the center of everything, any contact with Germany was a repudiation of the 6 million and a desecration of Judaism and the Jewish state. He was so incensed that he publicly equated Ben-Gurion's Mapai party with the Nazis. Both sides went to the Bible to bolster their positions. And unsurprisingly, they each found passages to buttress their views. The film shows Ben-Gurion's foreign minister, Moshe Sharet, invoking the line in the Book of Kings, "Have you murdered and also plundered?" referring to the prophet Elijah's anger at King Ahab, who killed a Jew and also took his vineyard. But Begin's supporters countered with a war cry, "Remember Amalek," pointing to the prophet Samuel, who orders King Saul to kill all the Amalekites, Israel's arch enemy. But Saul, covetous of the wealth of the Amalekite king, leaves him alive and instead seizes the best of his sheep and oxen. This sin, half-hearted revenge, motivated by greed, Begin likened to reparations. Now, this hardly remained a dispute over biblical texts. Begin's own profound loss in the Shoah, his great sacrifices during the struggle for statehood, his marginalization in the new Israel, all boiled over. Undoubtedly, his passion was genuine, but he was also trying to use this issue to energize the base of his far-right party. In the first Knesset election, it had won only 14 seats out of 120, and then slipped to a mere 8 seats in the election of 1951. And so during the Knesset debate on reparations, Begin delivered a tirade to a rally of 10,000 people, many of whom came wearing a yellow star. And he incited a riot of many hundreds who marched with him to the parliament. They smashed its windows with rocks, one of which hit an MK in the head. They burned nearby cars. They had to be subdued with tear gas, which Begin falsely shouted to the crowd was the same kind of gas that had asphyxiated Jews in Auschwitz. And that only infuriated the mob more. Ben-Gurion, who was also Minister of Defense, had to call out the army to protect the lawmakers. But he instructed them not to use live ammunition against their fellow Jews. The scale of this is really remarkable. 92 policemen were injured during the rampage, dozens of them hospitalized. 400 rioters were arrested. Inside the chamber, Begin went up to the podium and rained down curses on Ben-Gurion. But the session had to be closed because of the uproar outside and tear gas billowing in through the broken windows. Begin was suspended from the parliament for 3 months. Now, Reckonings contains rare footage of the riot, which resonates with us because of the insurrection of January 6, 2021. Let's play that clip from the film.
The emotion was very high in the Knesset, but it was nothing compared to the atmosphere outside the streets.
לפני הדיון נואם בגין בהפגנת המונים בכיכר ציון. ההצבעה כבר נעשתה בטרבלינקה, באושוויצים. שם הצביעו יהודים בעינויי המוות. כסף השילומים יביא לטיהורם מהאשמה של המרצחים הגרמנים.
The prominent leader that executed this demonstration was Menachem Begin, an Holocaust survivor. When Menachem Begin ended his speech, stones were thrown against the police officers, and some members of the Knesset were injured. This was actually the first time and the last time in Israel history that the Knesset was stormed.
The motion to approve negotiations with the German people passed, but only by a single vote.
Okay, thank you. Now, let's look at the next slide now. There are many written accounts of this terrible day in Israeli history. The best that I found is that of Tom Segev, pictured here. He conducts research like a meticulous academic, but he writes in the lively style of a journalist. And let's scroll down to the next one. You see, I just put two of his books here. The one on the left covers this period in great detail, the 7th million. And I recommend it highly for anyone who is interested in that tumultuous first decade in Israel's history, particularly the way Israel related to the Holocaust. That's from the early 1990s, and to me, it still holds up as the best account. The one on the right is very recent biography of Ben Gurion. And in my mind, that's the best biography of Ben Gurion we have yet. Okay, you can remove that. Now, when the Knesset finally reconvened after hours, after the mayhem, which Ben Gurion called a failed criminal coup d'etat, it was uncertain whether the reparations agreement would pass. One member of Knesset had taken ill and was brought in to vote on a stretcher. The rhetoric continued to be as frenzied as before the riot. I'll quote just one MK, member of Knesset, a respected physician and historian who nevertheless exploded in fury. Here's what he said. What do I want from Germany? A mother for a mother, a father for a father, a child for a child. My soul would be at rest with 6 million German dead to match the 6 million Jews. If we can't do that, at least we can spit in their faces. Now, as you just heard the narrator, Michael Berenbaum, state, the bill passed by a single vote. In a vehement radio address that evening, Begin called every German, including Adenauer, a murderer, and insisted he would fight to the death over this issue. But he soon backed down. He went into a tailspin of depression, and he seriously considered leaving politics. Now, looking back now, 70 years after the intensity of those days, it seems the opposition was overwrought. The benefits of reparations, astounding. None of the fears of the near hysterical naysayers turned out to be warranted. Of course, Germany never embraced Nazism again and became a strong parliamentary democracy, a cornerstone of NATO and the EU. And the government in Bonn and later Berlin paid the restitution on time, undeterred by the vagaries of Middle Eastern politics. And the reparations agreement hardly led to forgetting and forgiving, as Golda Meir worried it could. Especially since the reunification of 1991, Germany has been exemplary in terms of Holocaust education, and commemoration. The film well conveys the enormous impact of the reparations on the Israeli economy in absorbing survivors, providing fuel, developing railways, the electrical grid, the water supply, obtaining heavy machinery for agriculture and construction, building up the merchant marine. I visited Israel for the first time in 1968. And while almost all the Jews I knew in New York wouldn't buy a German car, I saw the streets of Tel Aviv filled with Mercedes taxis. Now, no less important than the massive aid to the newborn Jewish state was the provision of the Luxembourg agreements that called for reparations to individual survivors in Israel and around the world, which turned out to be the lion's share of the restitution. The lump sum payments and monthly pensions have often made a difference in the standard of living, on average adding about 10 to 15% annually to their income. Reparations continue as we speak. Last year, about $500 million was distributed to over 100,000 elderly survivors around the world. Another $500 million was granted to more than 300 social service and cultural agencies. Recall, Goldman and Adenauer were negotiating for about $1 billion. Well, in all, Germany has paid $86 billion. Can we conclude then that the project has been an unqualified success? The film certainly gives you that impression. But unfortunately, that's not the whole story. In fact, the program has had its pitfalls. Let me mention some unintended downsides for Israel. As you know, there was a deep social and economic divide between the Ashkenazim and the Mizrahim, the new immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa. They were usually less educated than those from Europe and often faced discrimination. The Ashkenazim, and even many of the survivors among them, were there earlier and better connected. Reparations accelerated this inequality. Many East Europeans, and even more so German Jews, could now afford larger apartments and better appliances. Jews who had recently arrived from Yemen or Iraq, say, obviously had no connection to the Holocaust, and they received nothing, which only added to their resentment. A related issue concerned Israel using the large bulk of the windfall for infrastructure, which critics pointed out greatly helped the Histadrut, the giant labor union closely allied to the Mapai party. No doubt, upgrading the new country's basic facilities was paramount, but some felt more could have been directed toward alleviating human suffering, especially that of the Mizrahi, many of whom lived in crude absorption centers through the 1950s. A different question of equity faced the kibbutzim. Most demanded that any member collecting reparations had to turn the funds over to the kibbutz to be used collectively. Many kibbutzniks refused to do that and thus departed. When individuals, Israelis, Americans, or other survivors, applied for restitution from the German government, a host of difficulties arose because the basis of the compensation was physical and mental suffering, claimants were often required to be examined by doctors chosen by West German consulates, whatever country they lived. This meant exams by non-Jewish, German-speaking physicians, including psychiatrists, often a frustrating and humiliating experience, and invariably releasing a flood of the most horrific memories. I studied copies of the reparation claims, including the voluminous medical records, submitted by a survivor whose memoir I co-authored. Represented by numerous attorneys, his case dragged on for many years because the Germans were not convinced that his injuries stemmed from Nazi persecution, but were rather sustained before or after the war, and in any case, had not diminished his earnings in America. In the end, he collected half of what he expected. Now, having researched his experience in the Holocaust in great detail, it became clear to me that he had exaggerated the harm done to him. He had not the slightest compunction about that. And I am not one to judge him. He was the sole survivor of a family of 7. He had suffered greatly in the ghetto and in hiding. The trauma would stay with him forever. I can understand how he would try to get everything he could from Germany, playing by the rules or not. However, I am critical of the claims conference, which grew enormously beginning in the mid-1990s due to a sea change in how reparations to survivors would be paid. Berlin decided it would no longer adjudicate the cases of individuals. Instead, it granted the claims conference in New York billions of dollars each year, and it awarded the money to the survivors. So the conference quickly expanded from a staff of a few dozen, which had primarily funded Jewish cultural, educational, and welfare institutions, to a staff of 400, now responsible for over 1 million individual survivors. With that came growing pains, especially regarding financial control. It did launch creative projects to aid survivors, including immigrants from the former Soviet Union, whom the Kremlin had not allowed to apply for reparations. But of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was possible. Another program of the conference aided righteous Gentiles in need. Yet another compensated former slave laborers. But many questions arose regarding the allocation of this staggering amount of money. Questions about transparency, oversight, conflict of interest, because much of the funding has gone to organizations represented on the board. That led inevitably to horse trading. I'll support funding your organization if you support mine. In 2011, a leading Jerusalem Post columnist spoke out against, quote, a small clique, unquote, with bloated salaries that dominated the claims conference. He demanded a thorough external investigation. He was infuriated that some survivors were still living in poverty 60 years after the claims conference was established. He maintained with some justification that the board was so focused on its own pet projects that it had neglected its chief responsibility. One of the scholars in the film Rachel Blumenthal, refers in her book to a closed shop, as she puts it, representing America and Europe almost exclusively, even though survivors have populated over 80 countries and in significant numbers in Argentina and Australia, which receive very little. She also points out that the allocations are arbitrary and there's no appeals process. Since its founding, the conference has added no new member organizations. But in the film, she voices none of these criticisms that she documented so thoroughly in print. Now, such fault finding is not uncommon in the world of philanthropy. Certainly with a global agency as enormous as the Claims Conference, operating over many decades, something like this is almost to be expected. But a huge scandal that came to light in 2010 glaringly illustrated something far more insidious than an old boys network, namely widespread fraud and a failure to take responsibility for it. The US Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara, indicted 31 individuals in a conspiracy that stole $57 million, which had been intended for the neediest survivors. All 31 defendants either pleaded guilty or were convicted at trial. 11 of these 31 were either current or former employees of the Claims Conference, including a long-serving top executive who received an 8-year prison sentence. Let's look at the next slide, please. Here you see headlines in newspapers from the United States and Israel, many different papers who headlines about for the stories about this scandal. In the New York Times, Reuters. Look at the last one from the Jerusalem Post. Claims Conference fraud likely much higher than 57 million. For over a decade, a criminal ring within the organization embezzled tens of millions of dollars through false claims. This is what my mother would have called a shanda f'degoyim, a disgrace in the eyes of the non-Jews. And it was picked up by the press and it was shown all over the world. Okay, can remove that. Now, what was this sordid scheme? How did it work? Well, it consisted of Claims Conference staff members and others they'd recruited roaming Brooklyn's Brighton Beach, a neighborhood filled with Jews from the former Soviet Union, and enticing over 4,000 of them to make bogus claims. Most had no connection with the Holocaust whatsoever. Some weren't even born until after the war. They forged their birth records. The ill-gotten gains would then be divided between the phony claimant and the conference employee or recruit in the form of a kickback. Any kind of fraud is abhorrent. But I'm sure you'll agree with me that embezzling money meant for impoverished survivors is especially despicable. Now, were these 11 criminal employees just a few bad apples? Maybe so. But the worst part of the story is that the board refused to be held accountable for enabling this web of deceit to go on for 12 years. As early as 2001, an anonymous whistleblower exposed the swindle to the executive board, which took no action in the matter. After the many convictions in 2013, the board hired an outside ombudsman to investigate the underlying dysfunction that had allowed this to happen. But after he wrote a scathing report on the leadership's dereliction of duty, he was fired and the board took no further action. The president and executive director remained at their posts and continued to serve until their recent retirement. Last month, I interviewed a former board member of the Claims Conference who served for a decade during this tumultuous time. Sam Norwich, the former CEO and publisher of the respected Jewish Forward Newsweekly. He was dismayed less by the scandal itself than by the lack of responsibility in its wake, and resigned from the board and wrote an article in the Forward expressing his strong disapproval. He then endured blistering personal attacks from other board members, one of them saying that he was more interested in selling newspapers than aiding survivors. Let me conclude by asking, what lessons can we learn from the triumphs and the setbacks of this mighty institution's 70-year-long history? Its early decades show us how much can be accomplished with Jewish unity, creativity, and determination. In the 21st century, though, we're left with a cautionary tale about the danger of elitism, mismanagement, and self-dealing. Although controls have finally been put in place to guard against the kind of scam that caused so much damage. Still, there was no need for the film to sweep the failings of the Claims Conference under the rug. Because disturbing though they may be, these are dwarfed by the tremendous achievements of the reparations project as a whole for Israel and individual survivors. I'll close with a line in the book by one of the film's commentators, Ronald Zweig. He wrote, "There have been few Jewish victims of Nazism whose needs have not been met." Thank you.